Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten, your host. Today we have back with us David Ramirez. He is the pastor of St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Union Grove, Wisconsin. Welcome back, Ramirez.
Good to be back.
All right, so we are taking a look at the gospel reading for the seventh Sunday after Trinity. It is Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. I'll go ahead and read that from the ESV, and then we can start discussing it. So here's the reading. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? They said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. All right. So context-wise, where does this fall in the Gospel of Mark? And does it at all help us in getting at what's going on in the text itself?
Sure. This is near the end of Jesus's journey with his disciples through Gentile areas. It starts when he goes, and that's in Mark 7, midway through the chapter. I'm just going to look up the verse number so folks know exactly when it is. Yeah, in verse 24 in the 7th chapter of Mark, this is when Jesus, it's recorded that he goes to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So he goes north up into what had been called, and well, I guess still was called, Phoenicia at the time. And the Phoenicians were these northern Canaanites, for lack of a better term. And under the Romans, these jurisdictions were called Syria and Phoenicia. But of course, way back when the Israelites, in the Old Testament, had entered into the land, these people were just cousins of the Canaanites. They were just part of the broader Canaanite family, and so he goes up there, and then he travels to the region in, I guess the Holy Land would be the best way to put it, of the Decapolis, which literally means the 10 cities. And that's a region that is, if you start off at the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Galilee, and you go southeast. So if you were to draw a line east of the Sea of Galilee and then south right along the River Jordan, that would be, and then made it a square, that area before you get into the desert and before you get too far south into Perea, that's the Decapolis. And the Decapolis is kind of an interesting area after Alexander the Great's conquests in Asia, when he destroyed the Persian Empire, set up, as we all know, all these different cities or colonies of Greeks, and these were centers of what would become known as Hellenistic culture, and they had a big Hellenizing effect all throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. And so these cities were Gentile cities. There was, it seems, still kind of a substratum of local or other native tribes that were in the area, but this was a region dominated by Greeks and other folk kind of bought into the Hellenistic program, and so Jesus travels through both of these areas, and we don't have a lot of the details of his route. The evangelists don't give us exactly where he went, but what's notable is that this is his travels when pretty much everybody agrees he's taking this time to teach the disciples and to train them for their future ministry. But it's through these Gentile areas, first in Phoenicia, in the region of Tyre and Sidon, and then in the Decapolis. And the Decapolis, like I said, was dominated by Gentiles, and it's outside of the bounds of even the old kingdom of Herod the Great. When Jesus was born, Herod was ruling. This is outside of that, actually. And then it was also outside of the Tetrarchy. It wasn't technically in the Roman province of Judea. And so they were really politically autonomous out there, even though they were part of the Roman Empire. But they functioned like old city-states, where you've got a city that's probably dominated by, Greco-Roman Hellenistic type peoples with their gods and goddesses and everything else. And then they control the surrounding countryside. I learned something. I know this is kind of trivial, but the capital of Jordan, Amman, that actually is probably one of those Decapolis cities. Not probably, it is. So yeah, kind of neat. So some of those cities still exist today. So he's there in the Decapolis, and I think that the Gentile context means a lot. If you notice the discussion that Jesus has with people all throughout this journey, it's from this point of view of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, whether it be the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman, as Matthew calls her very pointedly, her making an appeal to Jesus based on the fact that she knows from the prophets that he's not to just be the Messiah to the Jews, but she has a claim on him too, because he's been promised to the entire world. He's the Lord of the nations. He's the Messiah for all peoples, going back to creation. And so I personally think that we should take everything that happens in these encounters while he's in Gentile-dominated area, with that in the background, that this is Jesus ministering to a primarily Gentile population.
And so that informs us in what kind of way? I mean, just that.
Yeah. So what, right? Yeah.
Well, I guess, you do get a sense when, he's much harsher when he gets down to Judea on all the people there. Whereas I don't want to say he's softer when he's speaking to the Gentiles, but he's not,
certainly not that
you don't
Canaanite
get this
woman.
Yeah, no, right.
Yeah.
But you don't get the sense like you should know better.
Right.
The way that you yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I totally agree with you. I mean, with the feeding of the 5,000, there's the discourse after that about him being the bread of life. There's just lots more details, and I think you're right that is reflective of that the Jews should know more, and they should be quicker to believe. I mean, how many times in the Gospels do you get these comparisons? Woe to you, Bethsaida! It's going to be worse for you than Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Because because you should know, to whom much has been given, much more will be required. And I do think that you see Jesus. I mean, he shows compassion to all people, but he shows compassion on these people for coming out and listening to him for 3 days. I mean, they've been out there in 3 days. Most scholars believe that this happened, in the summer, or and summers there would have been pretty brutal. So it's not like you're out there in cool, nice weather, and it's been 3 pleasant days, and you're just a little hungry. These
Hmm.
people have been out there for 3 days, and it's not like the feeding the 5,000. And I think that it's natural for us to compare and contrast the 4,000 and the 5,000, the feeding of, and and this is a minor detail, but you think about the feeding of the 5,000. Specifically, the Gospels say he had them sit down where? On the grass. I mean, you've actually got
Hmm.
lush grass. We should think about, uh, in the Midwest when, the grass finally comes alive after the winter and you got some spring rains and it's just lush. It's beautiful. It's nice to sit on. Now, mid-July, it's not so nice to sit on, and that's even in the Midwest. I think over in the Near East, it is quite a bit rougher. The grass has died back, or at least the ground is very hard. Their planting seasons are different over there than ours because their winter is much more a time when you can have more fertile harvests and fertile crops and do your harvesting. You do it opposite over there, and so I think that the whole picture uh, we should really take into account where it's not just a Gentile context, but you have these people who don't know much because they are Gentiles, and they are also out there listening to this man who has performed miracles, who's opened the mouth of the mute. And even if we don't know where all Jesus has gone, the crowds certainly know where he is. They know where to find him. They have found him, and they're willing to sit out there in the heat on the hard ground. And if it's really hot, you get dehydrated, you get hungry. So I do think that the broader context of the journey among the Gentiles really is important for the setup.
Yeah. Okay, so translation issues. Any major issues in translation? Our synod president has gone into Splagnidomai for many years now, so you can probably listen to a
Yes.
past sermon from him on that. But
Yeah, I think Splagnidomai is like you say, it's been talked about a lot, and rightfully so. I do think that that's a good comparison, though, to make with the feeding of the 5,000. What motivates Jesus? It's his compassion, and his compassion, rooted in his love for mankind, is going to be demonstrated by his providential care for these folks. I mean,
Mhm.
so that's not really a translation issue, but as has been noted many times, compassion here is not just, oh, I feel sorry for someone, but a deep rooted, um, deep seated on your heart, on your spleen, whatever you want to say, uh, great compassion and rooted in love for the people. And think about it, these pagans, literally, these pagans have sat out there and listened to him teach for 3 days. How many people would
Yeah.
sit and listen to a 3-day sermon?
How many
um,
pastors would actually give one?
yeah, exactly right. I mean, obviously he's sleeping and they're taking breaks, but yeah, I don't think that there's huge amounts of translation issues that need to be discussed, but I do think some clarifications on uh, what the disciples say to him in their answer is important, because it's not really an issue with the Greek to English translation, but just about what exactly the referent is. And I'm looking at verse 4 when it says, let me read Jesus's words again, if you don't mind. He said, since we were talking about
Hmm.
compassion, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And then he raises this, potential scenario in 3. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. If you're going on a journey, I mean, I think we just need to look at the logistics for a second. If you're going on a journey to go see this prophet, this holy man, this wondrous figure who you've heard about, and whether you're going to see him to hope to get better that he heals you, or whether you're going to listen to him, or whether you're just tagging along with the crowd, there's no gas stops or welcome centers. So you're bringing along food and water. And so I don't think we should assume that these people brought nothing, but they brought stuff not expecting to stay so long. And that's why Jesus is saying, if I send them away hungry, they're hungry right now because they've exhausted their resources. They're gone. As we would say, they're running on empty already. And if we send them away now, they're not going to make it. Or at least it's going to be a lot of hardship. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way because they're walking and they already have exhausted their resources. And some of them have come from far away. And then we get to the disciples' question. And his disciples answered him, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" Now, in English, just like in Greek, that word "one," how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? How can one do this? Usually when anyone, whether in Greek or in English, says "can one," the Greek is "tis." When you say that, it's a very universal statement. We might say, "How could one slam dunk on a rim 20 feet tall?" I mean, I can't even get 10. Probably not 9 either anymore. But but you're saying it universally. If I said, how could one jump over that chasm that's 40 feet in length or whatever, you're not just saying how could I do that? You're saying how could anyone do that? It's a very universal way to speak, and it's a proper translation from the Greek to the English. However, I do think that it's important that we note in Matthew the word is hemin, and that's really denoting we. How can us, right? Us disciples feed these people with bread here in this desolate place. And Lenski, who is good in many ways and very careful with his Greek, even though obviously we would disagree with him on very substantive issues of objective and subjective justification, and sometimes he's a little wonky, but he is a master at Greek, and I personally have been convinced of his note on this, how he says if Mark, he says, uses tis to really refer to the group that's speaking. So it's not as universal, if that makes sense, as it comes across in English, or in other ways other writers use the word tis in Greek. And then I guess I already said it, but also he points out that in Matthew, when Matthew records the feeding of the 4,000, he uses the word hemin, which makes it very clear that they're talking about us. How can we feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? So the only reason why I bring this up is because it raises the question of what kind of a question are the disciples asking? And this is one of the biggest points, I think, in this pericope, or in this lesson. Are the disciples just doing a retread of their unfaithfulness and slow to believe behavior, like in the feeding of the 5,000? There, it's incredibly clear. They're almost getting sarcastic with Jesus. With what do you expect us to do? What do you think is going to happen? But Lenski, and also Failing. Do you know Failing by instance?
I don't.
The Life of Christ, Failing. This is a Missouri Synod book, actually, published by CPH back in 1936. An old treasure of the Missouri Synod, you might say. And it's a great book. It's just called The Life of Christ. And it just walks through the life of Christ. It walks through the the Gospels, but it goes through in chronological order, at least Failing's chronology of what happens, and so it is in a sense a harmony, but with his commentary kind of mixed in at points. I think it should be on everybody. It's insightful, but Failing Failing agrees with Lenski actually, and he says this. I want to just read it for you. Jesus manifestly had the intention to perform a miracle again, but it would be presumptuous on the part of the disciples to suggest a repetition of the miraculous feeding at Bethsaida. The reply is this: whence should we have so much bread in the wilderness as to fill so great a multitude? And then Jesus, of course, responds, how many loaves do you have? And so Failing is of the same opinion as Lenski. Lenski talks about it far more extensively, but I don't want to read pages of Lenski for you. Their point is that by making it clear that they are admitting that they can't do this, but without the kind of the mocking or snarky comments that you have in the feeding of the 5,000, such as in Mark, and I'll read that for a sec in a minute. The disciples are the ones, if you remember, that come to him. This is a desolate place, and the hour is late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat. And then Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? I mean, they are preemptively wanting Jesus to send them away. Then they are saying that they can't do this. I do think that there's some sarcasm and snarkiness towards our Lord there. But here, Lenski and Failing are trying to make the play in terms of interpreting this, that no, actually, they are not wanting to be presumptuous, but rather, and now this is me speaking, they don't make this comparison, but I think they would, is that this is much more like Mary when she finds out that she's to bear the Messiah. How can this be? This isn't Mary saying, that's impossible, but rather this is faith-seeking understanding, as the church fathers used to say. And as I try to always teach my parishioners, that there is a difference between questioning God, as colloquially said, like, oh God, how is that even possible? And it's almost impossible to do this without tone, versus, okay, God, you say it's going to happen. I believe you, but how? And there is a difference there. And we see that in Luke very clearly between Zechariah, who is mocking what the angel is declaring to him, and he's punished for it, and then Mary, who is obviously demonstrating faith, but seeking understanding, that she is a virgin, and so she doesn't understand how this will be possible. And so Lenski and Failing, contra most people, in my experience, are trying to take the side of saying that no, the disciples are actually sitting back. They've learned at least part of their lesson from the feeding of the 5,000. And this is not to dispute that they're still slow to believe and of little faith many times, but they have learned their lesson that Jesus can perform miracles about multiplying food and feeding people. But this is a rare thing, and so they aren't asking him, nor are they doubting that he can do it, but rather they are just simply, okay, where can we find this bread? How are we to do this? I don't know. I don't know if I'm 100% convinced on this, but I did want to bring up the point with the Greek, that the seemingly universal way of taking this. How can anyone feed this people with bread here in this desolate place? That's not proof positive that this is a retread of the feeding of the 5,000. And if you look at the Greek in Matthew, that's very clear that you can make a very legitimate argument that they're saying, how can we feed these people? Kind of like, if you're going to do it, you're going to do it. You tell us how to do it, but we can't do it ourselves. And also, Jesus has initiated this congregation. If I send them away, they're going to faint. Many from far away, I have compassion. I think he is saying, I'm going to do something here because of this problem. And they're saying, okay, where do we find it? What do we do? I don't know what you think about that. I got to say, I'm about 75% convinced by it. I haven't thought about it in previous years because I had always kind of taken for granted that this was a retread of the 5,000 doubting issue. That's how Kretzmann takes it too. I hate to go against Kretzmann, but I think I might have to.
Yeah. Yeah. Does the Dinesetai help us at all? Not just in terms of possibility, but capability. From where are we able, or is one able to do this?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously an issue of power and with ability, and I think that it, again, is how you read their response. I don't think anything inherent in the verb is going to help us personally, because if you read it like they are questioning period point blank the possibility of a period, then that usage fits into that argument. If you accept that they are emphasizing that they cannot do it, but they're excluding Jesus from that category of being unable, then it helps Lenski and Failing's interpretation. So I don't think the verb itself really helps us. Let me read Lenski. The disciples declare that it is beyond them, in fact impossible for any of them to furnish from any source, here in this uninhabited desert place, the required quantity of bread. They imply that it is Jesus alone who could do that. And then Lenski goes into the whole, that tis cannot include Jesus, pointing towards Mark's usage of the word, and also the hemin in Matthew. And also he brings up another...
That's the hemin, that's the hemin in the Matthew 15, right? The feeding of the 4,000 in Matthew.
Yes. Okay. Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, you have the same account, or you have the same incident recorded by Matthew and Mark. They're the only ones who record the feeding of the 4,000. It's not like the feeding of the 5,000 where all evangelists do it, but it's only Matthew and Mark, and the disciples are. Lenski's point is that they are referring to themselves when they're saying they're not capable to feed these people.
Gotcha.
And in Matthew, it's very clear that it's the we.
Yeah. So in Matthew's account of the feeding the 4,000, he actually has hemin, we. Where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place?
Yeah. And that helps inform our understanding of tis here.
Yeah. Okay. And then likewise, they're already assuming, based on the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew, that, or in John, and in Matthew, that they're waiting for his directions. Where are we to get this? Yeah. So, because he says, they say in Matthew, early on, in chapter 6, send them away, and then he says, "No, you do it." Right?
Exactly. Right.
And then,
right. Yeah.
So in this case, in Lenski's view, they're already anticipating that he's going to do this. He's going to tell them to do it.
At least a possibility. Yeah.
And so he says, "Okay, well, point."
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So point us in the direction. Tell us what to do.
Yeah.
Is that Lenski's?
I mean, you're filling in more than what Lenski explicitly says and what Failing explicitly says, but I agree with you. I think that's their point. Especially both of them use this word. They don't want to be presumptuous, and I do think that who's starting the conversation? The lack of evidence doesn't always prove something, but there is no snarkiness, there is no arguing, nothing like that. I mean. And we do have to remember, unlike Bible denying people who don't believe that these are actual real historical events, we have to take into account that they literally have seen the feeding of the 5,000. Now, I know that signs and wonders don't create faith in and of themselves. And I know that people see lots of signs and wonders in the Gospels, and they're still slow to believe, including the disciples. But my point is that they've seen the feeding of the 5,000. They know Jesus can do this. They have been rebuked over this before. And the tone, if we don't import what if we don't collapse the two narratives into each other, but actually see their distinctiveness, I think that reading it kind of for itself, then I think that there's a real reason to believe that they aren't saying, oh, this is impossible. I mean, it comes down to tone. Are they saying it, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? Instead of,
Yeah.
How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? Like Mary, how can this be? And also, the disciples are, it's interesting how they phrase. Oh, where is it now? I lost my place. Yeah, in 4,
verse 4,
cortasai. And that is courtisine, right? So this is really to fill these with bread,
Yeah.
I mean, that I guess is
so it's not the. Yeah. So instead of saying, how can we provide enough, like in John, for each one to get a little, they're saying,
yes, exactly.
To fill them up, to satisfy them.
Yes. And so you asked me earlier, are there translation issues? And I guess I lied. There is this one. I mean, R4 says, how can one feed these people with bread, right?
Yeah.
And it's how can one feed them to satisfaction with these bread.
Yeah.
And Lenski does point to that as kind of as a side supportive point of saying that, they're asking, how can we do this to a maximum? Mm-hmm. Lenski says, we observe that the disciples do not speak of a minimum, like you, and then he points out what you just pointed out in John 6:7, that everyone may take a little, but rather to fill these with bread, a maximum. It's in the aorist to indicate, as Lenski says, complete, like completed filling. It's the aorist. It's the simple past. It's a completed action. Obviously, them talking about it in the hypothetical, but that's not the point. So I think that those are some of the points that, again, it's been fascinating for me to look at this part of it, because I mean, obviously, any preacher, pastor, any layman reading through the Gospels is going to naturally compare the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000. And yet I do believe on this particular point about the attitude of the disciples, I have collapsed their attitude with the feeding of the 5,000. And Lenski and Failing have really kind of opened my eyes to another possibility that I think we should take.
Yeah, and this makes sense. Thinking of John 6 and the feeding of the 5,000 there after the Bread of Life discourse, and everyone goes away, and he says, do you guys want to go too? And then Peter says, to whom shall we go?
Yeah,
you have the words of eternal life. So in a sense, you almost have that same thing. Like, where should we go? You're the one calling the shots here. We'll do what you tell us.
Well, and also, so you've got the Bread of Life discourse, right? And you have Peter saying that, and then you also have, after the feeding of the 5,000, what do the crowds want to do to Jesus? They want a bread god. They want more signs, and they get in trouble for it. And later in Mark 8, people get in trouble for more signs too, but those are different people back on the Jewish side of the lake. But my point is that after the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples are hyper aware that Jesus does not want people demanding signs and turning him into a bread god. And so Lenski makes the point that this would even make them more reticent to ask for a miracle or to suggest it. If he's going to do it, he's going to do it, but don't demand it. That's not to say that we shouldn't pray for miracles. I don't want to mislead people on my point here. We should pray for these things, but we don't demand a sign. There's a difference between asking or entreating God and demanding. And so, Lenski and Failing make the point that after the feeding the 5,000, taking that into account, maybe, well, they don't say maybe, they say you should read this as them presuming Jesus is potentially and can do a miracle, but they are neither going to deride that possibility like they did before, nor push him for one, but they're waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find myself in a strange place where I don't think I've really preached hard on the feeding of the 4,000 where the disciples are unfaithful, and because you do that much more clearly as a preacher with the feeding of the 5,000. But in my mind,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe I've said it before, I don't know, I have always just taken for granted that this is a retread of their weakness and slow to believe and slow to have faith,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm kind of questioning that.
So just to jump ahead a little bit, and then we can get back. Should we then, in application, see perhaps not our lack of food, but we don't have great crowds at our place, so we do have lack, at all, throughout the United States, throughout the world, the church is kind of shrinking. Should we have a similar attitude that the disciples, or that you are contending for the disciples having here, which is, you're the one who can provide this. We look to your direction while we are in the wilderness of, it seems like we're in Gentile territory, right?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, not specifically, but we're not in a place that the church has standing anymore, or at least is looked at as a positive good. Is this the kind of attitude then that we should have among us, to look to God to provide that in the midst of the lack?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the main point of this whole pericope is believing that God will provide, and for us to look and to know and to have trust in His providence, His providential activity and nature flowing from His compassion. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus uses this word, that He has compassion on the crowd. It is a central word. That's why so many people make a big deal about it, and that tells us from whence these providential acts come from. But also, more importantly, like you're saying, whether it is us worried about literal sustenance and food, or whether it's a man who is out of work and is waiting and praying and hoping for a job, or whether it is people begging the Lord for rain so that they can eat, or what have you, or like you said, the church hoping and praying that we'd be strengthened numerically, and also that our people would shake off apathy and embrace the zeal of the Lord, or whether we ourselves need refreshment. I think that's the main point, and that's why, even if myself or others or most preachers maybe have perhaps incorrectly identified the disciples as a bad example of that instead of a good example, I mean, that doesn't change the point that I think all of us who are preaching according to the analogy of faith and seeing the main point in this passage is that this is directing us towards God's providence rooted in His compassion and love for us. So I think even
this is first article, fatherly divine goodness and mercy, catechism stuff.
Without any merit or worthiness in me. Yeah, I believe so. I know that many people, even some of our professors, would point to a sacramental or spiritual understanding of the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000 and try to link it very tightly with the Lord's Supper. And by the way, I don't think that's a bad thing to do. I just don't think it's the primary referent. I think that what you just did by saying, "Hey," you didn't use these words, but you to use the word I used, providence. I mean, if we can trust in God's providence to, He's going to provide, well, then let's apply that to our situation as Christians in America today. I mean, you were talking about spiritual goods, people coming to faith, people coming to hear preaching of the word. I was talking about zeal for the Lord, strengthening of faith. I don't think that's inappropriate. But I do think that it's important to establish that here Jesus is very blunt about, he's concerned about their physical welfare. I mean, it's just very clear. They've been with me 3 days. They got nothing to eat. They're going to faint hungry on the way home. Some of them are really far away. This is a very earthly concern. And while I don't think that it's wrong or inappropriate to point towards how God provides us with spiritual nourishment and that we should give thanks for all of our daily bread and understand the spiritual significance behind it. And I don't think it's wrong to say, hey, how does our Lord most majestically feast us? Well, it's with his true body and blood and through his word. And that's all great stuff. But I do think that we gotta read the text as it is, and that this is the primary referent here is to just feeding people. And God provides, like you said, these are first article gifts. I kind of get sick of that phrase, but I mean, it's true.
Yeah, so do I. But in a sense too, you could almost, if you are, if you're preaching on this, you could almost run an argument from the lesser to the greater. If he has done all these things and still promises to do them, how much more will he not also give you these things, or from the greater to the lesser? So you could go the route. Right? Yeah, exactly.
That's what he does, right? Look at the lilies of the field. I mean, I'll be a little bit more snarky, but I mean, you could have a contemporary English translation of that part of the Sermon on the Mount. If God cares about these stupid flowers, don't you think he cares about the pinnacle of creation, mankind? I mean, that's the point, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right. So the next thing I think I'd like your take on is, so if we're not going to spiritualize this immediately to go to the Lord's Supper, although it's not inappropriate to do so,
sure.
What do you do with 7? What do you do with the numbers? Do you do anything with the 7? Or is it just like, historically there were 7 baskets and there were 7 loaves?
Well, so I've been on Lenski's side and Failing's side, but now I'm gonna cut against that grain. I have always seen 7, and I do think it's notable that it's repeated. So Jesus asked the disciples, "How many loaves do you have?" 7. And then he immediately directs the crowd to sit down, and he takes the 7 loaves and he gives thanks and all that kind of stuff. And everything happens, and then they ate and were satisfied, and then the disciples took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. I mean, I don't think that this is a mistake, or not a mistake, obviously not a mistake, but a coincidence. I do think that 7 is not arbitrary. I think it is pointing to the days of creation and rest, the first week. And and again, I think that we should see this in parallel or compare and contrast to the feeding of the 5,000s, both seeing the similarities and how by seeing the common themes that run through, but also the differences. And I got to look at that and say, okay, how many baskets are left over in the feeding of the 5,000. It's 12. Jesus is feeding Jews. That's highly significant. I mean, 12 baskets left over. That means all 12 tribes will be satisfied and full. I mean, that's how much Jesus is the bread of life. And those who feast upon him in faith shall be satisfied. And here with this, maybe not exclusively, but primarily Gentile group or crowd in the midst of a Gentile-dominated area, it's 7. I mean, 7 is just such an important number, not just reflecting God's perfection, but also, the week of creation and the day of rest, and that's universal. And it makes sense that these signs or symbols or numbers would reflect that Jesus's universal nature of his messiahship and his impending suffering and death on the cross and resurrection, and that he's raised for all mankind, that he atones for all mankind. He's not just the Messiah for the Jews. And so I do think that it's very strange. Lenski basically rips this to shreds, or so he thinks, and he mocks it. He doesn't even give an argument. He just says, that's stupid, basically. I mean, he just dismisses it. Kretzmann doesn't say anything about it. Neither does Failing. It's just,
well, there is a different word for basket here than in the feeding the 5,000 too.
Yes.
Is there any significance to that?
Yeah. So
the spiridos is what St. Paul was let down in. So is that bigger than the kophanoi?
It is bigger. It is. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought this up, because I don't think it's huge significance, but the scriptures consistently use these two different words. So, the spiritas are, that's that's the 7 baskets, and the kophanoi are the 12 baskets. And as you just said, in Acts, I think it's 9, Paul gets let down in a spiritus, or that's the plural, but whatever. If a man can be let down, and from other usages of this word, that means that it is very likely that these 7 baskets after the feeding of the 4,000 contain more than the 12, actually. I don't know what you want to make of that, because even that is just a probability. I mean, if you're making baskets by hand, they aren't going to be of the exact same size every single time. And, you've got 7 big ones. How big are the 12 small ones? It might be, it might even out pretty close. But I mean, I think that you could make a point that these are much bigger baskets. It probably meant that there was a lot more bread left over, and this might yet be again a point where the gathering in of the Gentiles is going to be even greater, kind of like all the parables of how those who were given the invitation spurned it, and the place gets filled up with Gentiles. So I don't know. I personally wouldn't make a big deal about it, because it's built upon not necessarily sure inferences. So I personally wouldn't make a huge deal about it, but I do think that the 7 is something important. I do think that this is a nod to the universal nature of Jesus's mission. And I just don't understand how people like Lenski think that this is just a coincidence. It's repeated twice, and I mean, the whole week of 7 days is built off of creation. The Sabbath is rooted in creation according to the 10 Commandments. I mean, that's what people who know the Old Testament should be thinking about. So I don't know.
So we've already kind of discussed, doctrinally, this is God's providence, his physical providence in creation, or his provision of sustenance. What other kind of doctrinal things should we highlight here, or could be an avenue for highlighting with regard to this text?
Yeah, I think that as much as I think it needs to be rooted in physical sustenance, and that's what's being done right here. Like you said before, the movement from the lesser to the greater is key. That word satisfaction, whether you're talking about it in Greek or English or Hebrew or Swahili or whatever, I mean, we all understand, and this is universal across cultures, after a big, nice meal, whether it be Thanksgiving or a birthday meal or something, you're full and you push back and, you're satisfied. We are
Sastified.
That's faticide, right? The satisfaction is not purely physical, right? I mean, we are enfleshed souls. We're body and soul, and just like you do feel good after a day's work, and you feel like crud if you've been a lazy good for nothing for a couple days. This is, to be satisfied. I mean, again, even though I think that this miracle is grounded in physical sustenance, and I think that's what's going on here, I do think it is important to move to the greater point that Jesus cares about them not dying of hunger or fainting from hunger, and this is a way for them to understand what his power, right? He is able, dunamai, right? He is able. He's the one who is capable, the capable one, to feed them physically, and he's also the one who has compassion upon them, who wants to and will. And how much more is that true for spiritual true satisfaction, where he's the one who truly you'll find true satisfaction with him. Or St. Augustine, our hearts do not rest until they rest in thee, O Lord. Or people will talk about every fallen human being has a cross-shaped hole in their heart. As cheesy as that sounds, It's absolutely true. And the only thing that's going to satisfy you, fill you, make you whole is going to be Christ and the forgiveness of sins. And that's where I do think we should move to man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. That yes, Jesus is the bread of life. He doesn't go into it here, but how much would he have gotten into, maybe not that particular phrase, but talking about him proclaiming the forgiveness of sins? We don't get a lot of his preaching on this trip. So, but the point is that we should be moving, especially homiletically in the sermon, towards how Jesus gives us not just satisfaction or water like the Samaritan woman needs, right? I'm going to give you the water of life, living water. And so I do think
give this to me also, so I don't have to come back here.
Exactly. Right. And a Samaritan who's a half pagan, right? To put it nicely, if she kind of sort of maybe gets it, but not really, and misapplies it, how much more are these pagans in need of preaching to help them understand this? And undoubtedly, Jesus gave that to them. Also, I think that the whole issue of demanding a sign is something that could be very important to preach on in conjunction with this, because immediately following this, the Pharisees demand a sign. Now, again, I think you can do this whether you believe that the disciples were being unfaithful and slow to believe, and this is just a retread of their attitude in the feeding of the 5,000, or if you want to say, no, they're actually a positive example. Either way, the main point is there, that how do we react to signs? And again, this is another place where I think that we should look at the feeding of the 5,000, because it's so similar. The scriptures beg us to look at both. And so regardless of that particular interpretive point about the disciples' attitude, I think the broader point is not just Christ has compassion upon us, rooted in his love. He providentially provides for us according to body and soul, but also how should we view him in faith? Should we be demanding sides? I mean, we kind of already talked about this. Should we be demanding sides? Should we never ask for them? Or should we do what I'm going to say at this point? Should we be like the disciples, faith seeking understanding, and being bold to pray? And but of course, in accordance with the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done." I mean, I always tell people, which I've heard so many pastors say this: if you can pray the Lord's Prayer and mean it after all your other prayers, then you've prayed rightly. And that's probably the hardest part. Thy will be done. And so, yes, you may have asked for a miracle. You may have asked for this. You may have asked for that. But you're putting it all under submission to God's will, and that you will accept his fatherly, divine mercy and goodness, not just without any merit or worthiness being the motivating factor, but also whatever that fatherly, divine mercy and goodness looks like too.
Yeah. Okay, so what about, is there any sense in which then there should be discussion of how we become, or that God presses us into his service to provide for others? So is there kind of a sanctification, third use of the law angle here at all when talking about this text? Or is this just solely kind of focused on what God provides, period?
Yeah, I do think so. I do think that we should see the broader context as this is a time when the disciples are being trained. And again, whether you believe that they are starting out in this particular incident as faithful or unfaithful, the point is the same, is that they need to listen to Jesus's instructions and follow them. I do think that they're in the right frame of mind. So I think that, if I were to go down this particular road, I would say something along the lines of that they have faith, but they are seeking understanding, and they are ready. Here I am, send me. But what am I supposed to do? And so we need to be attentive to God's word. Jesus, very similar to with the disciples, has announced his gospel, right? I have compassion on all nations. I mean, he says the crowds here, but whatever. The point is, if we're going to apply it here, I have compassion, and we know he's had compassion. He's suffered and died. He's bled for our salvation, and now he wants his disciples to minister to these people. And so they follow his instructions. So God's announced his compassion, and now we should actually look to God to see how we too should minister to those around us, whether that means minister in the more narrow sense of pastors reading God's word, listening to what he's sent us to do word and sacrament ministry, or whether that means you're a father or mother or a brother or a servant or master or whatever, that you find yourself on the table of duties in your many roles and in your many, stations in life. Yeah. And you listen to God's word on what you should do, and you do it the way God says to do it. And again, I think that this is maybe a tertiary substantiating point to the fact that the disciples have the right attitude, because they just do it, right? I mean, how many loaves do you have? 7, okay. Then he directs the crowd, undoubtedly through the disciples, to sit, and then he takes the loaves, he blesses them, he gives thanks, he gives them to the disciples, they set them before the people. I mean, it's again, okay. What do we have as resources in our congregation? Well, we have this amount of money in the bank. We expect this many offerings. We have these people who have these gifts and talents. We have those people who have needs. Okay, what are we going to do? I mean, I think that in terms of exhortation and third use of the law or sanctification is listen to the word of the Lord and be ready. Be ready to do what our Lord wants us to do. And again, if you're using the disciples as a good example, a positive example, then disciples, what do? They sit and listen, and then they go and do. And that's what we should be about. And that we don't always know what our commander is going to tell us, but we should be ready and quick to believe, because he's already shown, just like the disciples have already seen Jesus feed the 5,000. Just like they've already seen all these amazing things. Our Lord got up from being dead. I mean, there's nothing he can't do. we should be ready to follow his instructions, as strange as it seems,
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Are there any things that we didn't touch upon that you'd like to make sure that you get in, or have we covered?
I think that, and I haven't totally thought it through, but I do think that this issue of how later on in the chapter, the disciples forget to bring bread with them. Now, you might say they're really busy and they leave in haste. You might say that now they think they don't need bread. I don't know how deep and how wide the confusion is on the whole bread thing, but they obviously have this problem with understanding that when Jesus is speaking about leaven, they're worried about actual leaven, and that's not really the issue. It's, do you not yet understand? I'm talking about false doctrine. And so I think that is a counterpoint that's not in our lesson proper, but I think it just highlights your point about, as much as this is about actual literal hunger and our Lord giving these people sustenance and satisfying their bellies, that this is to point us towards what is going to make us sick if we drink it or eat it. What do we have to be worried about or concerned about, might be a better way to put it. And that is false doctrine. Man does not live by bread alone. Stop worrying about what you're going to eat and what you're going to drink. Yeah, sure. God knows that you need to eat, but what you really need to worry about, not worry because our Lord says not to worry, but you know what I mean. What you really should be attentive to and be concerned about is the poison that kills your soul, and that's false doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
The leaven of the Pharisees.
It almost seems as though it's like they forgot bread and they're talking about it, and then he's pointing out you got to beware of the false doctrine of the Pharisees and of Herod, and they're still talking about bread, and he's like,
yeah.
Why aren't you listening to me? Like,
yeah.
Are your hearts hardened? Do you not understand what's going on here?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's where you see Jesus is the master teacher, and you see this in all great Christian teachers or preachers or theologians. I was just talking about this in my Thursday morning Bible study here at St. Paul's, where Paul will talk about, no, it's not works righteousness, right? We're saved by grace through faith apart from works of the law, right? And then, wait a second, I want to make sure you don't fall off on the other side of the horse too, right?
Yeah.
So if we're not saved by works, does that mean we should sin so that grace may abound? No, you morons, do not think that. And I almost think like, I think that Jesus is maybe doing something similar here, where he's saying, yeah, you need to believe that I can provide, and but on the one hand, they still should be bringing bread and not forgetting about it, and but at the same time, bread's not everything either, and they need to be worried about the leaven of the Pharisees. And so I mean, any good teacher hits the same topic from different angles, right? This is why I never understand why Bible deniers always are like, oh, Jesus said the Lord's Prayer this way, this place, and used slightly different words here. Or he said this, and then he said it slightly different. Ooh, these must be different traditions, and oh, they're commenting on each other, blah, 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 blah. Or maybe he's just a good teacher and he talks about really important stuff multiple times, and he's saying the same thing in different ways so that you have a 3D picture of the point. That might accord with common sense and how we experience teaching in our everyday life, but who knows? Everyone likes to be too clever by half. But that's what I think he's doing here. He's forcing them to think about God's providence and what they should be concerned about, but also what's the real danger? The real danger is false doctrine. That's what's going to kill you. Don't fear the one that can kill the body. Don't fear starvation. Fear spiritual starvation. Fear the lies of the devil.
Yeah. Then is leaven of Herod the same thing, false doctrine, or is it kind of similar to the rich man? I mean, I suppose that's false doctrine, but it's like a false hope, idolatry of things over the true God.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I just kept summarizing because I think both of them are false doctrine, but you're right. They're two different species of temptation or false doctrine. I mean, the false doctrine of the Pharisees, while yes, there are Pharisees that get, Jesus attacks the Pharisees for being carnal and only caring about filling their bellies and, the praise of men. But I mean, here I think it's in opposition to one another. I mean, not opposition, but two different species of false paths. The Pharisees with works righteousness and hypocrisy and all this kind of stuff, and the Herodians are. The Pharisees, for all of their bad points, they hate Rome. They, you know what I mean? Like they don't want to be Hellenized. But the Herodians, they're in bed with Rome. I mean, they care about power and obviously wealth too, and they're collaborators. I mean, if the Pharisees are Jewish nationalists, who some of them probably even tend in towards the Zealot party, the Herodians are falling off the horse on the other side. But they both have idols, whether it's works righteousness or power or Rome or hating of Rome. The devil gets you in many different ways, and I think again that just again is the same point where Jesus knows that we are stupid, drunk peasants, like Luther says, constantly falling off of the horse or the donkey on either side. You overcorrect and then you fall off that side, and then you overcorrect and you fall off the other side. And he wants us on the straight and narrow. So I think that's what's going on with the false leaven of the Pharisees. And I think false doctrine is a fine summary, but obviously there's different species of false doctrine or temptations.
Sure. Good. Well, hey, thanks for your time, Ramirez. And
sure.
I'm sure we'll find some other things to talk about some other times.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, take care.
Yep, you too.